I call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to say prayers.
Let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all wisdom and power are derived, we beseech thee so to direct and prosper the deliberations of the Parliament now assembled, that all things may be ordered upon the best and surest foundations for the glory of thy name, and for the safety, honor, and welfare of the people of these islands. Bless our Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth II, Charles, Prince of Wales, and all the royal family. Give grace to all who exercise authority in our Commonwealth, that peace and happiness, truth and justice, religion and piety may be established amongst us. Especially, we pray for the Governor of our islands, the Premier, the Speaker of the Parliament, the Leader of the Opposition, Ministers of the Cabinet, ex officio members, members of the Parliament, the Chief Justice, and members of the Judiciary, that we may be enabled faithfully to perform the responsible duties of our high office. All this we ask for thy great name's sake. Let us say the Lord's Prayer together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace now and always. Amen.
Please be seated. This Honorable Parliament is now in session.
Reading by the Honourable Speaker of Messages and Announcements.
Honourable members, I rise to briefly mention three issues. Firstly, as most of you may be aware, that there has been an unfortunate and very disastrous fire in Honduras on Saturday in the Bay Islands, the island of Banaca or Guanaja. The fire destroyed, we understand, over 200 homes and properties, ravaged business establishments, and caused significant material loss. This has left remnants of concrete houses with no roofs and no windows. As a result of this imperative that we take the initiative to offer and render the necessary assistance where we can. In light of the fact that I have spearheaded, engaged, and conducted humanitarian efforts many times of these sorts in the past, and most recently in the Colombian Islands and Nicaragua and Honduras. We know we will need coordination of these efforts. To that end, I'm holding a meeting in my premises on Tuesday, that's tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., to organize and help coordinate the effort. We need to observe and take note of this tragedy, and that we will mobilize efforts to assist our neighbors, family, who we have inseparable ties with. I know the Premier and members of government is already on the ball. Also, in connection with today's meeting, the public is in the galleries to understand there is no use of laptops or cell phones in the gallery. Secondly, the government have found it necessary and important to convene this special sitting of the House. Evidently, the primary and fundamental issue relates to COVID. I would urge the general public to apply the public health protocols as stipulated and promulgated by the government. All members of the public is welcomed anytime to be in the public gallery. However, they must adhere to all public health protocols pursuant to the COVID-19 regulations in existence in this House. I would like to emphasize that we will inevitably have to live with COVID within our midst. To that end, you will recognize that all members of this honorable House are adhering by wearing their face masks and how conform to what has been specified in the existing regulations as best as we can. Anyone thinking otherwise, the government is difficult in space because of the numbers, and they choose where they want to be. The opposition is more able to distance, and they have done that. We take our obligations seriously in this House by implementing the necessary control measures to mitigate and prevent any potential spread of the COVID virus within these hallowed halls. The health of our staff is important and paramount, so appropriate steps are being instituted, which includes staff rotation, among other things, and also is the well-being of all honorable members and the visiting public and users of this House. Let me also make it abundantly clear that it will be a requirement to follow the protocols in order to visit the House of Parliament, for business or for otherwise. And so therefore, again, those of you in the public gallery are asked to distance yourselves. I think space is there. Distance yourselves accordingly. We all have a duty and responsibility as leaders of this country to lead from the front, and residents and citizens alike will be guided by our practices and actions here in our House. Let's all, as a society, do the right thing by conforming to the laws enacted and the set of guidelines and regulations as new interventions and scientific development unfolds. Lastly, let us, as members, all now observe the installation of the electronic clock timer so that members are fully aware of the remaining time as they speak, and also the electronic bell, which will serve to notify members when Parliament is about to resume from any break, ringing 3 minutes before and before start, that is, and a ringing on start time. All these we have talked about for a long time. In fact, well over 36 years. Thank you, honorable members, for your time. Again, those in the gallery, please conform to the regulations, not only for COVID, but the regulations of this House, which states that you who sit in the gallery are welcome any day we are here, any time to visit this House. We urge you to do so. However, there is no laptops use, only for the media. There's no photographs from a regular camera or from your laptop or from your cell phone. There is no use of them in the House. Please, please observe the regulations of this honorable House.
Government business, bills. First readings. Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021.
Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I'm really just seeking a bit of procedural clarity. This is the first time in which we are actually, I've ever been involved where we have a special sitting of the House.
Are you rising on a point of order of some kind?
Not a point of order, sir. It's a seeking procedural clarity with regard to...
You want, I'm sorry, I'm not hearing. You want to speak on procedure?
Yes, sir.
Oh, continue.
Okay, sir. I note, Mr. Speaker, that it is normally the role of the Business Committee to set the order of business that is before the House, particularly as it relates to bills. But no such meeting was called or held before this meeting convened. So I'm just trying to understand, why that might be the case, and particularly in the way the bills themselves have been ordered.
I don't know if any member from the government side care to respond. However, the notice was given for a special meeting, and therefore the bills are in order. And from my standpoint as the chair, the bills are in order. However, what members choose to do is a different ball game. But the bills are in order. Honorable members, the House is in session, and therefore business is to continue. All matters pertaining to this special meeting have been followed as per our standing orders.
Yeah, I've done one already. Should I refer to it again? I'll say it again.
Have you said that the business right now?
No, I've just read through. I just said customs and border control. So you will say the bill has been done. I'll start it.
Caution.
Government business bills, first readings, Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021.
The bill has been deemed to have been read the first time, set down for the second reading.
Cayman Islands Coast Guard Bill 2021.
The bill has been read the first time and is set down for the second reading.
Immigration Transition Amendment Bill 2021.
The bill has been read the first time, set down for the second reading.
Second readings. Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021.
The Honorable, the Deputy Premier and Minister responsible for Customs and Border Control.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the second reading of the Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021.
So ordered. The member speaking.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Thanks, Chris. Mr. Speaker, I want to start out by saying that this government did not arrive at this decision lightly. I'm proud to say that from the onset, Mr. Speaker, that this government took the policy decision that we would not compromise or play politics with the lives of the Caymanian people. Mr. Speaker, you of all people should know that as the first Premier of these beloved islands and a former member of Cabinet, you know the responsibility that comes with being in government and the difficult but necessary decisions that are required to protect our beloved home. Mr. Speaker, this government questioned everything. This is not to say that we did not trust the advice given to us, but rather to highlight that our democratic system of government requires that we also must verify the information that is given to us. Similar to the advice that was given to the previous government, Mr. Speaker, we were also advised that we needed a local vaccination rate of 80% in order to have some level of herd immunity in our community. While we did not doubt the 80% requirement, Mr. Speaker, we wanted to make sure that we use the right population number and opted to use the upper limit of the population range provided by the Economics and Statistics Department. Mr. Speaker, before going on, I just want to give you something here, since I'm going to kind of just make a brief reference to it. Let the speaker for me, please. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I just copied 2 pages from the Labor Force Survey Report for fall 2020, and in particular page 8 and page 9. And Mr. Speaker, that report was actually published in February 2021, 2 months before the general election and 2 months before this government assumed office. And Mr. Speaker, on pages 8 and 9 of that report, Mr. Speaker, you can clearly see that the Economics and Statistics Department estimated that the population was 65,786, with a lower range of 60,566 and an upper range of 71,006 people. Again, Mr. Speaker, this report was from February 2021, 2 months before this government assumed office. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the member for Red Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could we receive copies of the document or the pages to which the Minister is referring? It would be helpful.
Honourable Minister?
Yeah, sure. You can even have my copy, Mr. Speaker. You can, yeah.
Are you seeking copies for everyone?
Yeah, that's right.
At least on your side?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, but he can proceed with his speech in the meantime. But we would like to be able to respond.
Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the difference between a population number of 71,006 and 65,786 is 5,220 persons. At an 80% vaccination rate requirement, that would mean an additional 4,176 persons being vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, this government set the difficult target of ensuring that at least 56,805 persons were vaccinated before we would consider removing requirements to quarantine for visitors to our shores. Mr. Speaker, this government was accused of being overly ambitious. Mr. Speaker, we were accused of being afraid to reopen, and the list went on. But, Mr. Speaker, what many of the detractors didn't realize was something that this government had that many did not. We have an unwavering belief in the capacity and the ability of the Caymanian people and those that call the Cayman Islands home to rise up and meet any and all challenges. History has proven this, Mr. Speaker, time and time again. And that, Mr. Speaker, is the story of the Cayman Islands. And time again, we are reminded the people who says it can't be done should not interrupt those that are doing it. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to report that as of last weekend, there were more than 55,000 first doses, which is 78% of the target, and a total of more than 52,000 second doses, which is 73% of our target, our overly ambitious target that they said could not be reached. Again, Mr. Speaker, those who say it can't be done should not interrupt those that are doing it. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, we're getting there day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. The people of the Cayman Islands have answered the call to help us protect those that cannot be vaccinated, either because of their age, their medical condition, or their personal belief. So, Mr. Speaker, the next question to be asked is this: what happens after months of hard work, dedication, and commitment? They are now telling us that we should just fly the gates open and let everyone in, whether vaccinated or unvaccinated. Mr. Speaker, think about this for a minute. A population of 71,000 people at an 80% vaccination rate requires 56,800 persons to be vaccinated. When we open this economy, and let's say that 5,000 people arrive on our shores, whether as guests that are just passing through or guests that are here to work, we're now being told that we should require those people to be vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, that is highly irresponsible and not something that this government or a vast majority of the Caymanian people can support. We would then be expected to have 76,000 people on island, Mr. Speaker, where only 56,800 are vaccinated, or 75%, 5% less than the target that we have worked so hard to achieve. As the population increases, Mr. Speaker, the local vaccination rate would get lower. This, again, Mr. Speaker, is something that we cannot support, and we cannot throw away months of hard work by the Caymanian people and many that call the Cayman Islands home. Mr. Speaker, I was pleased, like thousands of other Caymanians, to see both the Honorable Premier and the Honorable Leader of the Opposition push to encourage people to get vaccinated. I was also pleased to see the many efforts by both the public sector and the private sector to push to get people vaccinated. I will also be the first to say, Mr. Speaker, that we could not achieve the 78% milestone that I mentioned earlier without the support of the members of the opposition. And I want to record, for the record, to reflect the appreciation of the members on the government bench to the members of the opposition, and in particular, the Leader of the Opposition, in joining the Premier in pushing the vaccination rate. But, Mr. Speaker, in order to ensure that the hard work by every member of this Parliament was not in vain, and that the hard work of the thousands of Caymanians and those that call the Cayman Islands home is not in vain, this is the first of two amendments that will be coming here today to ensure that our vaccination rate stays above the 80%, so that our people and those that call the Cayman Islands home remain protected. Mr. Speaker, in order to ensure the persons seeking to enter and reside in the Cayman Islands through the existing Customs and Border Control Act 2021 are in compliance with local vaccine requirements, similar mandatory vaccination will be required for eligible persons and their eligible dependents when applying for or renewing the following category of facilities: student visas, and secondly, persons seeking permission to enter and reside in the islands through the grant of a cabinet permit. By the same token, Mr. Speaker, the Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill 2021 provides a person making or renewing an application under Part 6 of the primary legislation would be subject to providing evidence that they have completed an approved vaccine course or undertake to complete an approved vaccine course or comply with any other directions provided by the Medical Officer of Health within a particular time frame. Mr. Speaker, again recognizing that not all persons would have access to an approved vaccination program, the bill allows for the applicant to sign a declaration committing to completing a vaccination course and presenting a vaccination certificate within 40 days after the application has been granted or renewed. However, Mr. Speaker, if the applicant or his or her eligible dependent fails to submit the vaccination certificate, then Cabinet or the Director of CBC shall revoke the relevant permission to land in, enter into, remain in, or attend an educational institution in the Cayman Islands and would therefore have to leave the Cayman Islands. Again, Mr. Speaker, this bill also provides for the Medical Officer of Health to grant an exemption from the mandatory vaccination program in exceptional circumstances, bearing in mind that some applicants for medical purposes are not able to comply with this requirement. Again, there are provisions for the Medical Officer of Health to submit quarterly reports to Cabinet for their information in this regard. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, please note that based on feedback received from Caymanians during the consultation process, it was decided to remove the requirements for A, dependents of Caymanians seeking long-duration permission to remain in the islands, and B, children of Caymanians seeking permission to enter who will become Caymanian by entitlement once they have lived in the islands for 1 year. And as such, Mr. Speaker, a committee stage amendment will be made to reflect those changes. With that said, Mr. Speaker, I'm asking all members of this Parliament to support this bill to ensure that we continue to protect all Caymanians and those that call the Cayman Islands home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the law of unintended consequences has never been repealed. As I listened to the Honourable Minister present the bill and make his case supporting it, that phrase kept returning to me. That expression, Mr. Speaker, is one that I try to keep in mind when considering new legislation, especially if that legislation ventures into uncharted territory and involves an especially thorny issue. The layman may wonder just what these thorny issues would be or could be. And after all, according to the government, this bill and the Immigration Transition Amendment Bill that we will debate later is being promulgated by the government to keep Caymanians and residents safe from COVID-19. In effect, it is to keep Caymanians and residents, whether vaccinated or not, safe from a possible health threat from non-Caymanians who are not vaccinated. On the surface, some may say that there is nothing wrong with this, but there are areas of this bill that give me grave concern, and hence my comment regarding the unintended consequences arising from the passage of the bill. Let me recite again, for those listening, from the objects and reasons that are contained in the bill. This bill seeks to amend the Customs and Border Control Act 2021 revision, the Principal Act, in order to provide in certain circumstances for mandatory vaccination and for incidental and connected purposes. Now let me stop here and note the first potential thorny issue that the government will face, that of mandatory vaccinations of certain persons before they are allowed to enter and reside in the Cayman Islands. Now, why is this an issue, you may ask? Our present law requires non-nationals who wish to apply to work and reside here to prove that they are not suffering from a communicable disease that would make the person's entry into the islands dangerous to the community. Mr. Speaker, in the case of the COVID-19 virus, being vaccinated is no indication that one does not suffer from this communicable disease. Only a suitable test for the presence of the virus before arising, and again after an appropriate quarantine period, provides sufficient satisfaction that the person is not infected with the virus and therefore unable to transmit it. What we now know is that vaccinated persons can acquire the virus and have a sufficiently high viral load to infect others. Therefore, mandating vaccinations is no panacea. Let me read further from the bill's objects and reasons. Clause 3 amends the Principal Act to insert proposed new sections 110A and 110B. The proposed new section 110A provides for additional requirements in respect of applications which are made under section 90, 94.2, 94.8, or 100 or 110 of the Principal Act. The proposed new section 110A provides for additional requirements in respect of applications which are made under section 90, 94.2, 94.8, or 110 of the Principal Act. The proposed new section stipulates that unless exempted by the medical officer of health under section 110B, certain categories of persons will be required to provide, in addition to any documentary evidence, information or prescribed fee required with an application, A, in the case of a person who has completed an approved vaccine course, a vaccination certificate, or B, in the case of a person who has been vaccinated with a vaccine course which is not an approved vaccine course, a declaration which is signed by the person and which states that the person will comply with any direction of the medical officer of health given with regard to vaccination, or C, in the case of an unvaccinated person, a declaration which is signed by the person and which states that the person will complete an approved vaccine course within a specified period, and that the person will comply with any directions as are provided by the medical officer of health with regard to vaccination, or 2, a medical certificate. The proposed new section also provides that where a person who has not completed an approved vaccine course fails to comply with the undertakings given in the declaration, the Cabinet or the Director, as applicable, shall revoke the relevant permission to land in, enter in, remain, or attend an educational institution in the islands. Potential thorny issue number 2 arises from some of the categories of persons the bill requires to have a vaccine before they are allowed entry into the Cayman Islands. Section 90 of the Principal Act has to do with the Cabinet's general ability to issue an entry permit for every person to the islands. This bill requires such persons to be vaccinated unless the medical officer of health exempts them. Section 110 applies to granting student visas, again requiring such persons to be vaccinated unless they are exempted by the medical officer of health. Section 94.2 applies to circumstances under the law where documentary evidence is produced to establish that a child is a child of a Caymanian. The child shall be allowed to enter, remain, and attend school in the islands. This bill would amend the current law to require that such a child of a Caymanian could not enter these islands to be with their parent unless vaccinated against the virus or is exempted by the medical officer of health. Section 94.8 applies to a dependent of a Caymanian who, under law, may be granted permission to reside in the islands for a period of up to 3 years, and which can be further extended at expiry upon application. The passage of this bill will prevent such a dependent of a Caymanian entering these islands or remaining here with their family when an extension is applied for, unless they are vaccinated against the virus or exempted by the medical officer of health. The potential impact on an unvaccinated child of a Caymanian or an vaccinated dependent of a Caymanian and their Caymanian families is indeed a thorny issue that should have given the government pause, considering the right to family life under Section 9 of the Constitution. I am confident that the government would have received legal advice on this bill containing those amendments and would likely I am confident that the government would have received legal advice that this bill containing these amendments would likely be constitutionally challenged and the government case may not necessarily pass muster. There may be other constitutional issues, Mr. Speaker, as well, that come into play. Given the potential impact to a Caymanian family, I do not understand why the government have been messaging over the past few months that their direction of travel was to mandate that work permit holders be vaccinated. This bill and the one to come clearly venture far beyond work permit holders in their effects. I have noted a statement from the Human Rights Commission dated June 3, 2021, entitled the Human Rights Commission Statement on Proposed COVID-19 Vaccination Policy for Work Permit Holders. So it seems that even they too understood that what the government was contemplating was a requirement on work permit holders, not one on children or dependents of Caymanians. It would be good to see what the HRC's views are on the actual legislation before us today. I have my doubts that they would have the same viewpoint that they do in their June statement, and that they would express similar concerns as I have. And having said that, Mr. Speaker, in a general way, I agree with the HRC's stated position that government can place conditions on the granting of work permits. However, I would question whether the HRC has appropriately considered the differences between a work permit holder who is not yet a resident here compared with one who is already resident and, to some degree, settled here. In the case of the former, I believe that the government would be on much firmer ground. On the latter, I have to say less so. Especially when one considers, as we all now know, that being vaccinated does not prevent one from being infected by the virus or passing it on to someone else. As the HRC acknowledges in their statement, any mandatory vaccination condition which government can put in place must be assessed and judged as lawful, rational, proportionate, and procedurally fair. In other words, in line with Section 19 of the Bill of Rights on Lawful Administrative Action. I take a pause right here, Mr. Speaker, to point out and reiterate that we on this side of the House are pro-vaccination. I happily joined with the Premier a few months ago to make a plea for the public to come forward, volunteer, and get themselves vaccinated. We have always supported and encouraged everyone in our community to become vaccinated for COVID-19. Every one of us on this side of the House were amongst the first to be vaccinated. Not everyone across the aisle can say that. Nor can they say that every minister in the government has always been publicly supportive of people receiving the vaccine. One need only look to the Hansards of this Honourable House over the last term to determine that. But I don't say this with any ill intent or any ill will. I want merely to ensure that our vaccination position is clear and not misinterpreted. I want also to clarify our position has always been to be one of choice, educating and persuading rather than mandating. And I will say it again, this position has become stronger as we have come to understand better the limitations of the current vaccines, as good as they are. Mr. Speaker, members on the government bench utilize their choice as to whether and when to be vaccinated. Indeed, one member, to her credit, recently went on record and noted that she had long held serious reservations about the vaccine, but eventually decided to take it up. And I commend her for that and for having the courage to do so. Just as I commend all the members of the government who in the end joined the vaccinated. But it was their decision, and it was theirs alone. It's our decision, it was our decision alone. Educating and persuading rather than mandating has done exceptionally well for us to date. And in my view, that is what we should continue to do. As of Friday, the Minister of Finance, in presenting the bill, said that we had some 51,759 persons who are vaccinated. That number represents the most likely population number as published by the ESO in their fall population, in their year-end December estimates of the population that we have been given here this morning. That represents 78% of that population number of 65,650, whatever it is. And Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Finance, in presenting the bill, made special mention of the fact that of government's estimate, using their estimates of 71,000 people and saying they were aiming for 80% of that number. But what that decision and that policy really represents is that it ignores a very sizable segment of our population who are not eligible for vaccination. And I'm talking and speaking of the children under 12 years old. That's a very significant portion of it, even on the most cursory of estimates. If you took that into account, and those who are not eligible, the older persons who might not be eligible, you're likely to be well known. A requirement of 80% is likely to translate into a number that is north of 90% of the eligible population. But the unfortunate thing is we don't have those estimates of what the level of that population is. But if you interpolate the numbers that's in that report that's done by the ESO, you come up with a figure of somewhere around 9, 10, or 11%. So we're not talking about 80% of the eligible population. We're talking about more than 90%, or about. You see how difficult we have always said it is going to be to get to that number. You're always going to have people that will reject it. You're always going to have people that will not comply. And with such a large segment of the population is not eligible. I keep saying that I think that the number is unreasonable. We're almost at 80% of the 65,000. A couple of days more with people volunteering will be there. So where we are is that there are roughly 14,000 people, many are Caymanians, who have either determined that they will not be vaccinated or are excluded from receiving the vaccine. We will, I am confident, surpass the 80% vaccination level, and we will climb even higher as we get closer to reopening the borders. As I've said before, Mr. Speaker, I believe that that in itself will provide a huge incentive for others to step up and voluntarily take the vaccine. We currently have one of the highest vaccination rates of any country in the world. There is no country in our region that I'm aware of that has a higher vaccination rate. Those are facts. We are in an extremely good, and I must say, enviable position. And this will get better as more people get protected by vaccinations and boosters. But we do have many people here, including many Caymanians, who will not be vaccinated or have their children vaccinated because that is their firm decision. They respect the choice. I wish this were not the case, but God gave us the free will to make choices. And so one would question the need for these mandates. Why is the government rushing across this shaky ground? Do they know something that we don't know? Why are they pushing this legislation that they know will likely end up in the courts under judicial review? It would be good if the government would be more forthcoming. Why we're given such little time that this is now a crisis or emergency when the government had...
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, the Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, as per the standing orders of this Honourable House, I think it's unfair that the Honourable Leader of Opposition is inferring that we are hiding something from the public. And that is borderline as to the standing orders to infer that the government is doing something untoward. The government is not hiding anything. And I would appreciate it if the Leader of Opposition would not try to infer that we're doing something or hiding something from the public.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, I think that you would try not to infer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not trying to infer anything, sir.
No, you did ask the question.
I did ask a question.
And by asking the question, Honourable Member, you know,
well,
you've been here long enough that people will take that to mean that. So.
And my point, Mr. Speaker, was
if you don't mean to infer anything, then don't.
My whole point, Mr. Speaker, was with regard to the shortness of the time period that we have with regard to this legislation. No time really to consider it, take discussions from and have discussions with constituents to find out where they are. But I think, you know, they have risen to the occasion, and we have heard some very loud representations made.
I think all that is in order in your speech, Honourable Member.
Thank you. Thank you,
just the inference that the government is hiding something which the member has complained about.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that they're setting out to deliberately do so, but that it begs a question. So I say, Mr. Speaker, in continuing, that regrettably, the government has not seen fit to discuss these bills with us beforehand. Neither have we been able to receive the promised updates from public health with regard to the present state of affairs and the lay of the land with regard, and the medical science with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. But I really cannot feel too badly for us in the opposition, because if we are honest, neither has the government had any genuine consultation with the public on these bills. They were only released 10 days ago. 10 days of public consultation is no time, really, especially given the length of time that the government took to bring the bill forward. Mr. Speaker, I just find it unacceptable. And that's what because the government is rushing the bill with little public consultation and with clauses that will directly impact Caymanian families, the public is rightly questioning the government's true intent. So, on Saturday, we witnessed there was public protest against the bills, and again this morning in the front of Parliament. Over the past 2 weeks, we have also seen the concerns about these amendments on social media and WhatsApp chats.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on point of order, and the standing order is 35-4, which reads, reference shall not be made in any matter in which judicial decision is pending, such in any ways might, or in opinion of the chair, prejudice injustices in parties thereto, or to members to impute improper motives to another member. The member did it again just now to say that they're questioning our motives, and that's against the standing orders, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition, the member is right. You can't, under this relevant standing order, the government has presented a bill, that is their motive.
Okay, and I bow to your ruling, sir. When I was interrupted, I made the statement and the point that over the past 2 weeks, we have also been seeing the concerns about these amendments on social media and WhatsApp chats. These are protests and concerns by many vaccinated and unvaccinated Caymanians, standing side by side in support of choice, in support of educating and persuading, but not for mandating. Caymanians who are concerned with the potential consequences, intended or unintended, of these bills. Seeing what I believe is a groundswell of concern, I would have thought that the government would have acceded to an extension of the public consultation period, or better still, withdrawn it completely. So, on this side, we in the opposition certainly do not support the bill, and we will be voting accordingly. Mr. Speaker, the government has also received, as we did on this side, a letter from KSG attorneys at law on behalf of their client, the Christian Association for Civics and Political Education. This letter lays out what, in our view, are clear concerns with the government's proposed vaccination mandates and what was viewed as threats to rights protected under our Constitution, including Section 2, the right to life, Section 3, prohibition of inhumane treatment.
Honourable Member, are
Yes,
you
sir.
reading from a letter?
I have the copy of the letter here, sir. At the appropriate time, I was going to
Please,
ask if I could
if
table
you-
it.
Well, I'd rather have a copy first.
Yes, sir.
And if you are reading from it,
Right, sir. Mr. Speaker, the letter was sent several weeks ago to, I think, to all members of Parliament.
this is a letter from, this is a local letter, am I, yes. And the government has this letter? Is that what
Mr.
you're
Speaker,
saying?
every member, it was addressed to and was sent to, as far to my knowledge, sent to every member of Parliament. Certainly, I can see on my side of it here, we all received it. Don't think it's just...
I think we better get members copies of this correspondence before you continue to read from it. So we'll have to just wait till we can quickly get the copies on the lead of the opposition.
Fine, sir.
Members are indicating that they have not seen the letter.
Mr. Speaker,
The Honourable Minister of Education.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's entirely a moot point whether or not members got it. Once it's referred to your honourable good self, the protocol is, as you would fully concur, that it is circulated to all members of Parliament, as you're now doing.
Honorable members might be aware or want to know that the letter is a huge document containing several pages, so that's what's taking up the time. They're getting it done as fast as they can. Honorable members, in the meantime, I should have, but on oversight, was not to recognize the passing of a prominent Caymanian, a prayer warrior in herself, and one who worked in the social sciences dealing with young people, Sister Linda McField. As I say, it was a prominent community organizer and worker, and certainly we want to offer our sincere condolences to her family. Also, there was the tragic accident of a civil servant and a border control officer, a very decent young man, Jesus Ebanks, and he has left a 9-year-old daughter and a 9-month-old daughter, and of course is their mother and father and their family, and we want to offer our condolences to them and put it on record. May their souls rest in peace.
Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Minister of Health.
Thank you. I too, on behalf of my colleagues, the government, and as the representative for the electoral district of Prospect, would like to publicly extend my condolences to Dr. Linda Maxfield's family. She's a stalwart Caymanian, and she will be greatly missed. Thank you.
I think all members now have the correspondence with the letter. Is it members' intention to read the letter, or are you satisfied that the Leader of the Opposition can continue? I think we will say that the Leader of the Opposition should continue his speech. What I would say to him is, since it's a long and legal letter, if he's going to read any part of it, that he should indicate it don't have pages, numbers, so please indicate what section you're reading from if you're going to quote the letter. But please continue, Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After that long pause, I can say, Mr. Speaker, I don't propose to read particularly from any section of it, but just point out the difficulties that they include as where the challenges are with regard to mandating vaccines. Mr. Speaker, I will pick up at the point where I was interrupted. The government has also received, as did we on this side, a letter from KSG attorneys acting on behalf of their client, the Christian Association for Civics and Political Education. The letter lays out what, in our view, are clear concerns with the government's proposed vaccination mandates and what was viewed as threats to rights protected under our Constitution, including Section 2, the right to life, Section 3, prohibition of inhumane treatment, Section 9, right to private life, Section 10, right to freedom of conscience and religion, and Section 16, freedom from discrimination. KSG has stated that their clients had grave concerns that a law that mandates vaccinations would be incompatible with the fundamental rights of people in the Cayman Islands that are enshrined in the Cayman Islands Constitution Order of 2009 and enshrined in international human rights treaties to which Cayman is bound. As such, KSG has put the government on notice that they will challenge the government in court should the bills be passed in Parliament. I will hope that each of you who now have a copy, that would all take a time and read this letter and read and understand what the true constitutional difficulties are. So I ask again, Mr. Speaker, why the rush? When the government must know that every indication points to a law that will be tested in court and has potential to be struck down. Why are we expending the energy on time on such a drastic measure rather than on more productive and less contentious matters? So contentious is it that it is impacting the wider society unnecessarily. I believe this morning that government would be on much firmer ground if they had chosen to limit a vaccination requirement to first-time work permit holders only. They decided not to do so, instead have chosen a path that is divisive, making the word vaxxed and versus non-vaxxed animosity even worse. And with these bills, they have now inadvertently introducing the us versus them, Caymanian versus expatriate element into the mix. I've seen it on the social media chats. Whether this is legally discriminatory is for a court of law to decide. But certainly on a moral perspective, it certainly feels very highly discriminatory. It is no wonder that I have received many letters and messages of concern about these amendments, with at least one from an investor stating in very clear language that should these amendments get passage, he intended to close down and liquidate his business and leave the island. In the past few days, I have received many letters, emails, and other messages urging me not to support the bills. Finally, you can add to this the genuine concern amongst the unvaccinated Caymanians and permanent residents that the government will take these vaccine mandates further. Mr. Speaker, late last night I did send the Premier a letter. The thrust of that letter essentially was asking the Premier to consider withdrawing the bill this morning, which has not happened. But what I would like to do, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, is to read that letter into the record. And I'll provide a copy of it for you, sir.
Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the letter says, Dear Premier Panton, Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill and the Immigration Transition Amendment Bill. On behalf of the members of the opposition, I write to advise that we have serious concerns with the above bills. As such, we ask that the government urgently consider withdrawing the bills when Parliament meets tomorrow morning. We have had concerns regarding these bills since they were published, and it became apparent how far-reaching they were, far beyond the scope of only work permit holders. Our concerns include, but are not limited to, the following. Bills this far-reaching deserve proper public consultation. These bills have received scant, if any, public consultation, and indeed, 10 days is insufficient time. Aspects of the bills impinge on the rights of freedoms of spouses, civil partners, children, and dependents of Caymanians. Aspects of the bills appear to be discriminatory. Indeed, they are also divisive and will, in the end, provide no absolute meaningful protection from the virus, since the vaccinated can also contract it and pass it on. The bills negatively, and we believe unfairly, impact a broad cross-section of persons who we have invited here to work, invest, do business, and live. Passage of these bills will have a negative impact economically and reputationally on our islands. We agree with the position highlighted in the letter from the law firm KSG that government's proposed vaccination mandates threatens rights protected under our Constitution, including Section 2, the right to life, Section 3, prohibition of inhumane treatment, Section 9, right to private life, Section 10, right to freedom of conscience and religion, and Section 16, freedom from discrimination. Our present law requires non-nationals who wish to apply to work and reside here to prove that they are not suffering from a communicable disease that would make the person's entry into the islands dangerous to the community. In the case of the COVID-19 virus, being vaccinated is no indication that one does not suffer from the communicable disease. Only a suitable test for the presence of the virus before arriving and again after an appropriate quarantine period provides sufficient satisfaction or evidence that the person is not infected with the virus and able to transmit it. In summary, the extent of the bills, especially the application to non-nationals only, appears to be unprecedented anywhere, and breach a number of fundamental rights protected by both the Bill of Rights and Responsibilities set out in the Cayman Islands Constitution, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights, by which the Cayman Islands is also bound. They have the potential to harm our islands economically and reputationally, and they are divisive. As such, our view is that if the legislation is passed in its current form, it is likely to be declared incompatible with our Constitution when, inevitably, it is challenged in the courts. What's more, mandating vaccinations will have no appreciable impact on the trajectory of the current community spread of the virus. The country would be well served by these bills being withdrawn when Parliament convenes on Monday. I look forward to your response. Yours sincerely, and it's signed by me as Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, right now...
Have you laid the letter on the table?
Pardon, sir?
No.
Do I need to formally go ahead and lay these?
Both of them should be on the table.
Okay, happy to do so, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg then to lay on the table, this Honourable House, the two documents that I've referred to, the letter from KSG and my letter to Honourable Premier Panton.
So ordered.
Mr. Speaker, what we read right now is a government capable of calming fears, encouraging more vaccinations and getting boosters in the arms of elderly and vulnerable who had their vaccines 8 or 9 months ago and whose immunity may now be less than they need. My plea this morning is simply this: let us not embroil the country in fear and more animosity. Instead, let us put away these problematic amendments and let us prepare the country to open safely. We have a pandemic to fight and to win. We have an economy to rebuild. We need every one of us to put shoulders to the wheel and work together to get this done for the benefit of everyone in this country. Mr. Speaker, to paraphrase the great United States President Abraham Lincoln, let us with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are here in to rebuild our country and to keep our people safe, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for those who have borne the worst impact of the COVID battle, the families and the businesses, and to do all which may achieve and cherish health, happiness, and prosperity for all who resides in these beautiful Cayman Islands. Let us all work together towards a stronger and safer Cayman for all the people who live here and love our islands. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I know that the public is enthused by certain speeches, but you're not allowed to clap or applaud anyone. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honourable the member for Raid Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things. Of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. Today, we speak not of cabbages and kings, but rather of COVID-19 and vaccines. Mr. Speaker, I see you looking at me queringly, wondering why I have opened with that. But Mr. Speaker, as you know, I love books and I love to read. And I thought of that verse from Lewis Carroll's The Walrus and the Carpenter. Because, Mr. Speaker, this government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, which they inherited from the government I had the honor and privilege to lead, increasingly reminds me of Alice in Wonderland, another of Lewis Carroll's most well-known works. Mr. Speaker, I know you read a lot as well, so you know that Alice in Wonderland is about this little girl in Kansas who falls into a rabbit hole and travels down it, and as she does so, she encounters a whole range of fantastical creatures whom she alternatively speaks to, asks questions of, or makes observations to. And so one of these, Mr. Speaker, is the Cheshire Cat. So when Alice met the Cheshire Cat, she said, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if you only walk long enough." Mr. Speaker, over the course of the almost 5 months that this government has had office, it's May, June, July, August, September, a little more than five and a half months that this government has had office, we in the opposition and the country generally have waited in vain for a clear path regarding the continued handling of this pandemic and the ultimate reopening of our economy. Mr. Speaker, when we decided as a government back in March of last year that we had to close our borders, we had to close schools, we had to close our borders, we had to impose a whole range of restrictions on the movement and activities of our people, we understood from the outset there was no way that this could be sustained forever. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, we thought the period would have been much shorter than it has turned out to be. But we always were not simply waiting and praying in vain. We were encouraged by the science in terms of the pace of the development of the vaccine or various vaccines. For we believed, as we still do, that the only way any country is ever going to be able to safely reopen their borders and live something approaching normal lives is if the vast majority of its population are vaccinated. Now, initially, we and everyone else, I believe, believed and hoped that the vaccine would be something that prevented you from getting the virus once you had it administered. But this is all very new. It is still very new. The vaccines which have been developed to deal with the COVID-19 virus, the SARS-CoV, I forgot what the other things are. No vaccine in the history of the world has ever come to market, if I may put it that way, so swiftly. Indeed, when the first vaccines were rolled out, they were experimental in nature. They got special emergency permission granted by the FDA and the various other agencies in Europe and elsewhere. Because the nature of this disease and the course it was taking was so devastating, killing so many people across the world, that those in charge of public health measures across the developed countries had to weigh up, do we take some chances that there are side effects, ill effects as a result of the administering of the vaccine, or do we just sit with our arms folded and let the virus kill off the vulnerable amongst us? Indeed, Mr. Speaker, there were some countries who initially took that view. Let the herd immunity resolve the issue, and the rest of the world can get on with it. I'll tell you now, Mr. Speaker, that initially that was the UK's view. I tell you now, sir, that it was against their advice that we locked down. Because it is one thing to live in a country of 65 million people where you are anonymous or near to. Not in my country of 65,000, because I can tell the Minister of Finance, when the census results come in, we have 71,000 people here in October, I'll buy him dinner for a month.
That sounds like a pregnant idea.
But, Mr. Speaker, it's another thing to live amongst your people and not in some ivory tower, as politicians in bigger countries are able to do, insulated from what happens to them day to day. When you have delivered as many tributes and obituaries as I and yourself and the other older members in this House have done, you come to understand what death really means to those who are left behind. And I told His Excellency, and I told everyone that I had to deal with about this, that I was not prepared as Premier to look people in the eye in Foster's, in Hurley's, in Country and Western, or wherever I was, knowing that because of a decision that my government failed to make, or a decision it made, one of my people died. I never slept well, and I usually sleep well, for that entire period. I went to sleep with it on my mind. It woke me up in the night, worrying about how we're going to manage this. But we always knew, with all the measures we took, many of which some lawyers said they wished to challenge, but we knew and we believed that what we were doing was in the best interest and it was constitutional. That is the difference. Because when you start to infringe on the rights and freedoms which are set out in our Constitution and in the European Convention on Human Rights and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, all of which, by which Cayman are bound, you can only do so if it is reasonable to do so, even if it is in the interest of public health. Mr. Speaker, no one need doubt mine and the Minister of Health, yourself, and all members currently in the opposition's belief in the vaccination as the necessary means to get us out of this crisis and to protect us and our people. We were among the very first to receive the vaccination. I want my booster now because I had my first one on the 7th of January and my second on the 28th. That's what I'm worrying about. So this is not a question or an issue for us that we are anti-vaxxers or we are in any way protesting about the vaccines. Members on that side, notably the Minister for Tourism, now went on a campaign against the vaccine. I have the record of his encounter with Mr. O.C. Connor on, what do you call it again? For the record. So, if there are any doubters about the vaccine, they don't reside on this side of the House. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's amazing the transformation that occurs once you walk from over here to over there. Because all of a sudden, now not content with making the vaccine available to everyone who wants it, not content at having achieved a vaccination rate which, as the leader of the opposition pointed out, is now well over 80% of what we believe the actual population to be. The government comes this morning, the Premier having for the first time since that provision has been put in the Constitution, used his powers under Section 77 to shorten the consultation period from the normally required 28 days to 10. On a matter of this import, on a matter on which people feel very strongly, and in a situation where, Mr. Speaker, we all must concede the jury is still out on the long-term, even the short-term, impact of taking the vaccination. I made that judgment based on the information I had. So did my colleagues and everyone, I presume, who has so far taken it. But that is our individual right to do. It is not for the government, however well-meaning they are, and however smart they think they are, to insist that someone has driven into their body something that they don't want. This is not akin to the restrictions on movement and other inconveniences which our lockdown caused. This is something incredibly intimate. You are forcing people to put a foreign substance into their body when they don't want it. Mr. Speaker, we cannot do this. They have a battery of lawyers over there. The Minister for Financial Services, the Premier himself, who led one of the largest law firms in Cayman and who went to law school with me, so I know he knows better. He got the same lessons I did. And not to mention the Minister of Education, who is very long in the tooth in both legal, constitutional matters, as well as the matters of politics. So it is not that they don't know. And it is not that they're not in a position to make that judgment. And I'm not going to put my dear friend, the Honorable Attorney General, on the spot. I'm not going to ask him to say anything, but I have worked with him long enough to know. Well, let me not go so far. I've worked with him long enough to be able to say.
Be careful, you put him on the spot.
To say that I do not believe that these bills with these provisions mandating vaccinations, particularly for people who are resident here and children of Caymanians and dependents of Caymanians, that those bills were brought here on the basis of his advice that they would pass constitutional muster. I do not believe it. Mr. Speaker, some of the members on the other side of the House were here just in the last term. Some of them campaigned on a whole range of promises. Sometimes, and I've had many people say this to me, Mr. Speaker, I can't believe so-and-so would say that, or so-and-so would do that after what he said, after what she said. And that, Mr. Speaker, reminded me of another encounter that Alice had in Wonderland. This time, Mr. Speaker, with the caterpillar. "Who are you?" said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know. Sir, just at present, at least I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then. What do you mean by that? Said the caterpillar sternly. Explain yourself. I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir, said Alice, because I'm not myself, you see. And that, Mr. Speaker, I believe, is what has happened to many of the members on the other side of the House. They are not themselves, you see. They have become, not like the caterpillar, having gone through the process of metamorphosis, changed into a beautiful butterfly. But rather, Mr. Speaker, into one of those rather unseemly moths. Mr. Speaker, what's your problem, sir? You talking to me? You'll get your chance, man. That's how it works here. When I sit down, someone else will stand up. Mr. Speaker, what is being proposed is wrong on a number of levels. But even so, I simply can't understand the logic. What really is the government trying to achieve by mandating that a whole long list of categories of people should become vaccinated? As I said earlier, we have already achieved far more, we believe, than 80% of the eligible population, the actual population, not the extreme view. So, as we know that the vaccination does not afford protection against contracting the disease, nor does it prevent the transmission of the disease. What is the point in mandating that people, us have already having achieved the rate that we want to protect the overall society from becoming, from too many people becoming so sick that our systems, our health systems can't manage it, and that they get really ill, and some of them die. But we've achieved that, by and large. They got the boosters coming. Why are we going to these draconian measures? What are we trying to achieve? Except to target what seems to me, some of the poorest and I'm trying to stay away from this. But let me just say it. The Jamaicans. Because we know that is the greatest demographic, single demographic, that are not taking the vaccine.
But I think, honorable member, and I know you have the experience to stay clear of that kind of accusation, though. Might be in your mind, and that's your privilege, your constitutional right to have it in mind, but I think that you should stay clear of it in your speech.
I'll be guided by your sage counsel, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, again, what is the government seeking to achieve? Aside from greater division, greater animosity, a greater feeling by average person in this country, even people like myself who've taken the vaccine, that how does government expect to force me to take something that I don't want and put it into my body? Mr. Speaker, that is the sort of stuff that we do not expect in democratic countries unless there are absolutely grave circumstances.
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, if the member is rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, he doesn't run this House, you do. I stand up on a point of order. Let him sit down, please, Mr. Speaker.
The point of order.
The member is rising on a point of order. Honourable Minister of Tourism, what is the point of order?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, as I referred to before in the standing orders, 35-4, the member is imputing improper motives. Now, if the member have read the bill, nowhere in this bill will it force anyone to take the vaccination. There is choice in this bill. Now, if the member have read the bill, he would know that. So I expect him, as a long-standing member of this House, to obey the standing orders to stop imputing improper motives.
You have made your point. Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps I didn't make myself clear enough. But your choice in many instances, as set out in this legislation, is to take the vaccine or leave Cayman and go home. So if that's what you want in terms of choice, then that's choice. Mr. Speaker, this applies to persons who have been legal and ordinary resident for 8 years, the spouse or civil partner of a Caymanian who applies for a residence and employment rights certificate, dependents of RERC, that is residence and employment rights certificate holders who have reached the age of 18 and apply for permanent residence in their own right, parents of Caymanian children whose marriage or civil partnership has dissolved, surviving spouses, civil partners, persons of independent means who apply for a residency certificate for persons of independent means, persons of independent means who apply to reside permanently in the Cayman Islands.
Honourable Member of Tourism, are you rising on a point of order?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I think the elected member from Prospect is... Sorry, my apologies. My apologies, Minister. Forgive me. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just want to clarify the terminology. Anticipating and speaking about the next bill. And he will have much time to speak about that, but right now we're dealing with the first bill, and he can't be reading from the other one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member, the Minister of Tourism raises the point of anticipation. And I think that, well, the standing order is very clear on anticipation. So you need to stay clear of that. Also, take my sage advice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've wondered, which is why the Leader of the Opposition asked the question at the start, why the government has interposed the Coast Guard bill in between the Customs and Border Control Amendment Bill and the Immigration Transition Amendment Bill. But, Mr. Speaker, you know me as well as most, and you know I'm a patient man. You know I'm a patient man. I'll just have to speak a little longer on the next bill, but I'll get the ground covered. I promise the Minister that. So, Mr. Speaker, let me leave that bit to the next bill and go through, sir, with your permission, the letter from KSG Attorneys at Law, which my leader laid upon the table earlier, and which surprisingly seemed to come as complete news to members of the government. It's addressed to members of Parliament of the Cayman Islands, 33 4th Street, Georgetown, that's right here. It's copied to the Governor of the Cayman Islands, Suite 101, Government Administration Building, 133 Elgin Avenue, that's where the government resides. And it's also copied to the Chief Medical Officer of the Cayman Islands. Every member of the opposition received it. But, Mr. Speaker, I would like to, that notwithstanding, I would like to take a little while to cover some of the grounds that are set out in this letter, even bits which perhaps I don't entirely agree with, because I think it is important that members of this House, especially, and the broader public as well, understand what is likely to transpire if these bills are passed in their current form. Government is going to be facing the judicial review of these bills on the basis that they are unconstitutional, or, to use the language of the Constitution, incompatible with the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, as you know only too well, the development of the 2009 Constitution Order, which for the first time provided the country with its own Bill of Rights, Responsibilities, and Freedoms, was a project that took almost 8 years. A big part of the challenge in doing that, in getting that done, was this issue of the Bill of Rights. I understand those challenges keenly, Mr. Speaker. I was in the midst of that when I was a backbench supporter of the government, which lasted but a year, when I was a member of the opposition, which lasted another 3.5, and then when I was a Minister of Education. So I know very well the blood, sweat, tears, and frustration involved in getting us that Bill of Rights. But the United Kingdom government said to us squarely, you will not get a new constitution if it does not include an acceptable Bill of Rights. But even in advance of that, Cayman had already been bound by the European Convention on Human Rights, which had been extended to us, and by the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which was also extended to us, I think, in 1986. Mr. Speaker, we have one of the most advanced Bill of Rights anywhere in the world, quite frankly, but particularly in the region. Something that we can all be proud of. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, and you know, everyone knows, I've spent almost equal time on both sides of this House. Too long, some may say. But the Bill of Rights is designed to protect the populace from the excesses and extremes of a government. Our Bill of Rights, the Canadian way, is slightly different. Our rights are vertical. That is, between the state and the subject, between the government and the citizen. They do not apply between myself and David. That's a different kind of relationship. And the importance of a Bill of Rights is precisely when we find ourselves in this kind of situation, where a government is seeking to do something that is, or things which are oppressive. The citizen has the right to say, no, Mr. Government, you can't do that to me. I'm taking you to court. And the court, if the case is made out, can say, sorry, the Parliament passed the act, and the governor signed off on it and published it, but we find it to be incompatible with the Constitution. Now, Mr. Government, go back to Parliament and make it right. That's how the system is set up to work. Now, Mr. Speaker, for the life of me, faced with the clear case and cogent arguments as to why what is being proposed in the legislation here interferes with rights granted under the Constitution, the government would still seemingly ignore all of that and say we're going to press on nonetheless, even if the day after we pass it, judicial review, leave is given to bring judicial review proceedings to challenge the constitutionality of what we passed. Why are they doing this? Mr. Speaker, if Cayman had a 35% vaccination rate, I think there would be a much stronger case for the government resorting to these draconian measures. But not when you're sitting at over 80%. Why do you need to drag those who have decided not to take it, kicking and screaming, to get the vaccination pushed into their arm? Or pack your bags and go home? Why? Is it to show how mighty the government is and how powerful they are? And how they're not afraid to make difficult decisions? You can find easier and better ways to do it than that. You might actually score some more points than you're scoring right now. Mr. Speaker, in the letter to members of Parliament, for those who are following with me, page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because the pages aren't numbered. Interference with the Bill of Rights and Human Rights treaties. I'm reading what is here. This is not my presentation. Part 1 of the Cayman Islands Constitution sets out the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is described as, quote, a cornerstone of democracy in the Cayman Islands, recognizing the distinct history, culture, Christian values, and socio-economic framework of the Cayman Islands, affirming the rule of law and the democratic values of human dignity, equality, and freedom. The status of the Constitution is such that any other law must be compatible with the rights that it enshrines. This would include any mandatory vaccination law. The Bill of Rights substantially mirrors many rights assured by the European Convention on Human Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights also applies to the Cayman Islands by virtue of it being an overseas territory of the United Kingdom. In addition, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was extended to the Cayman Islands following the United Kingdom's ratification of the Treaty on the 20th of May, 1976, not 86, as I said earlier. Below, we set out how a mandatory vaccination law in the context of the current COVID-19 vaccinations available will violate fundamental human rights under the Cayman Islands Bill of Rights. We refer to decisions of the European Court on Human Rights as these are relevant to how a court would likely approach the equivalent rights under the Bill of Rights. Section 2 of the Bill of Rights provides, everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No person shall intentionally be deprived of his or her life. Section 2 mirrors Article 2(1) of the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 6 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights also protects the right to life and is drafted in similar terms. The right to life under the Bill of Rights is absolute, subject only to the qualifications stated in Section 2, subsection 3, which are not applicable here. Deprivation of life where absolutely necessary in 1, the defense of any person from violence, 2, in order to effect a lawful arrest or prevent an escape, and 3, in order to suppress a riot, insurrection, or mutiny. Medical danger to life. Again, this is the submission from the lawyer on behalf of the Christian Association. Make sure I get the name right for the record. Christian Association for Civics and Political Education. A mandatory vaccination law will require individuals to take the vaccine whether they are willing or not, or face penalty. Where there is evidence that a vaccine may create a medical danger to life, there may be a violation of the right to life. See the European Court of Human Rights cases of Boffa et al. Against San Marino and X against Austria. It is well established that there may be an interference with the right to life where life is endangered by an act of the state, as well as when actual death occurs as a result. Our client has serious concerns that COVID-19 vaccinations create a significant medical danger to life. As such, imposing mandatory vaccination interferes with the right to life and violates the Constitution. Mr. Speaker, the letter goes on in detail to back up their evidence as to why they've come to this conclusion. I'm not going to treat the House to all of that detail, but I'm going to say I've sat where the Premier currently sits for nigh on 8 years. Faced with this, would I proceed with this kind of legislation? Absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, another ground is inhuman treatment. Section 3 of the Bill of Rights states, no person shall be subjected to torture or inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. Section 3 is reflected in identical terms by Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. It is represented in similar terms in Article 7 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. It is our client's position that given the evidence identified above, to impose a mandatory vaccination upon individuals in the knowledge of the risks involved amounts to inhuman or degrading treatment. Individuals should be provided with all necessary information and given the choice as to whether they wish to proceed with receiving a vaccination in light of such full and up-to-date information. Then there is Section 9, Mr. Speaker, private and family life. And this, Mr. Speaker, this ground, I think, is one of the strongest applicable in the current circumstances, where the effect of the passage of the bill in its current form will be that people who have already set up house here, who have connections here, will be required to take the vaccine or uproot themselves and leave. Section 9 of the Bill of Rights states, government shall respect every person's private and family life, his or her home, and his or her correspondence. Nothing in any law or done under its authority shall be held to contravene this section to the extent that it is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in the interest of public health. That's the relevant bit. So this is what's called, Mr. Speaker, a qualified right. The government can, in appropriate cases, infringe upon the right to private and family life to the extent that it is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society or in the interest of public health. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have struggled, as I'm sure anyone listening to the presentation by the Minister of Finance, to find any reasonable basis, anything that could be conceived or perceived as reasonably justifiable in a democratic society in what he said, given the context. We're over 80% vaccinated. Why are you insisting on dragging people kicking and screaming to take the vaccination? The society is already protected to the extent that a vaccine can protect you. And those who choose not to take the vaccine, run the risk of becoming seriously ill, so the science tells us, more ill than if you had taken the vaccine. Right now, that's all the vaccine does for us. It makes your chances of getting seriously ill or worse that less. That's the current science. Next week, the scientists may say something else, because this thing is constantly evolving. And I'm not being facetious. It is that this is also new, that everybody is still learning. Even the greatest minds, medical minds, are still learning, because it'll take time and trials for the vaccine, for the full impact of the vaccine to be known. So as I said, having achieved the vaccination rate, which any country in the world would consider reasonable, how can it be reasonable? What public health issues are we addressing by forcing people who would not take their vaccine otherwise to do so? It is forcing. It's your bill, Minister, not mine. Mandatory vaccinations, I'm back to the letter, Mr. Speaker, quoting from the letter. Mandatory vaccinations violate Section 9, the right to private and family life. The physical and psychological integrity of a person is of vital importance to an individual's private life. A person's body concerns the most intimate aspect of private life. That's from a case called YF against Turkey in 2004. Private life includes an individual's individuality, integrity, self-determination, and autonomy. That's from another case in the European Court on Human Rights in 2002, entitled Pretty against the United Kingdom. Naturally, this includes an individual's right to make decisions relating to their health and body. It is therefore not surprising that any act that threatens that physical and psychological integrity can amount to interference with private life under human rights jurisprudence. Any compulsory medical intervention, however minor, is an interference with the right to private and family life assured by Section 9 of the Bill of Rights. This obviously includes mandatory vaccinations. In Solomakin against Ukraine, another case from the European Court of Human Rights in 2003, the following is stated. Compulsory vaccination as an involuntary medical treatment amounts to an interference with the right to respect for one's private life, which includes a person's physical and psychological integrity as guaranteed by Article 8. The corresponding section in our Bill of Rights is Section 9. There can therefore be little doubt that the enforcement of a mandatory vaccination law would amount to an interference with Section 9 of the Bill of Rights. No. I have to go back and count because you don't have page 1, 2.
Honorable member, if this is a convenient time, I would like to suspend proceedings for the lunch break, and we'll resume at 2:30.